Hi, here is Markku Wilenius, your traveling futurist. I'd like to talk something about Latin America. I've been talking about the potential of the Latin America, but now I want to concentrate on what are the key learnings. Some of the key learnings that comes out of the mistake that these societies and economies have done in the past for us to learn for the future. Of course, Latin America is very diverse, but there are some commonalities there among the countries and among the economies. And one thing which is striking coming out of the if we look at the history of them, comes the way how these kind of internal conflicts have been rising around the continent. In the last, let's say, 20 to 30 years, there is an extra component to that, which is a thing about the oil. If you look at the oil countries, oil-rich countries around the world, the one thing is quite striking, namely that what the oil usually does to the economies, it is hampering easily the diversification of their portfolio of the economies of those oil-rich countries. This is true when we look at now the countries like Russia and so many other countries that have sort of narrowed down the options for the future, so to say. When we look at the Latin America, this is certainly true. When you look at the Venezuela, one of the oil richest countries in the world, it is strikingly true that the country that has such a huge assets has become so poor. Today, its political stability is next to none, and there are a lot of people that are living in extreme poverty. Country is politically torn apart, and so forth and so forth. So what caused this? When we go back to the 1980s and 90s, the country was then quite well run. One of the richest, one of the most stable countries in the Latin America. People from all over the world were actually pouring into Venezuela, into Caracas and other cities, either to visit or to have a work there. And there were prospects that showed that this country could really grow and be not only one of the wealthiest countries, but also one of the most stable and sturdy democracy. But then came Hugo Chavez, who was a man, I guess, with a good intention, but didn't know how to deal with the money. And when the oil money started to pour not only to the public sector, to the education and health and all those goodies, it also started to pour into the pockets of this political and economic elite. And it corrupted the country completely. So today, if you look at the corruption index, the Venezuela is the bottom of the Latin American countries, which is a very sad development, taking into account how rich the country was and the people inside, well educated and so forth. And in spite of all of that, the country went down with the corruption and with a too narrow economic policies, and in the end a lot of authoritarian rule. And that was also what Chavez in the end do, and after that Maduro, and that really brought the country down. So that's a sad example. Another rather sad example is, of course, Colombia. Colombia, that is known of the Latin American countries, have had traditionally probably the best education system, that were drifted into these internal conflicts decades ago. And the reason for that was that the country itself was too sort of unequal. The land ownership was focused to the few, and there was a lot of discontent and the governments in those days just couldn't solve those problems. Then later also came narcotics, drugs trafficking, and all that just made things worse. So what happened was that this country was in practice in a state of the civil wars for several decades. And of course, what does the civil war does to the country? It ruins it, not only economically, but culturally, and I would say also psychologically. So now that the peace agreement finally was done, of course it means a new beginning, but there are very, very deep wounds there in the country, and it will take a long time to recover and find the new way for Colombia, who by itself is a hugely rich country, not only with a big chunk of population, with high education levels, but also with huge natural assets. It's the country that has the most biodiversity than any other country in the world. So that's another sort of a rather sad story of a country that have had already decades ago huge potential, but never was able to fulfill that. Hope it does in the future. The third rather sad example I want to draw here is the case of Cuba. Now, Cuba before Castro and Communist Party was highly unequal, with a lot of US influence and with the influence of the big money. But it was also the country which had a beautiful culture and still has a beautiful culture. Those days, back in 1940s and 50s, the cities were beautiful. Havana is one of the most beautiful cities that has ever been built on earth. But all of that were kind of ruined down by the rule of the Communist Party. The revolution had a very good purpose to bring more equality and bring more democracy to the country. But soon after the revolution, Fidel Castro changed his mind quite completely and took his role as a dictator together with his brother Raul. And of course, when you establish this type of a hugely hierarchical system, the system cannot provide any good for its people in the long run. So what happened was that the whole culture and the whole economics of the country was practically run down. So to the extent that even today, the country, for instance, doesn't have any really sturdy, sustainable agriculture to provide food for its people, simply because the system of agriculture was simply just brought down, completely reversed from what it was before, which was, to be honest, very unequal system over large land ownership. But what came instead was this collectivization, which deprived of any kind of ownership of the people. And even today, the situation is still the same, which means that we have a Cuba which has a hugely fertile soil, very rich nature, but cannot even produce food for its own people. And the people are now starving because the commodity prices have gone up, and Russia doesn't anymore provide such a support than it was doing as a continuation of the Soviet Union. That was a very, very strong relationship. So the country became hugely dependent on import, and that of course was a part of running its own economy down. I've been enough in Cuba to know that every commodity there, let's take a simple thing as the glassware. There is one factory in Cuba that produces glasses for the country, and it has only one line working because that factory was built somewhere in the 1960s, and it has been not actually renovated ever since. And this is just kind of example. Now, the country itself is full of wonderful people that by nature are very entrepreneurial, but the political system has not allowed that entrepreneurial spirit to be used for the good of the country and its people. And of course, US embargo, which paradoxically has been supported by the Cubans living in US, particularly in Florida, is not doing any good for that either, and it really should be a stop as a token of a period of time which was very different than the world that we are living today. So those sort of three examples are the ones that where we can actually learn a lot. So for any country that is planning its economic policies and social policies, it is important to diversify the economic portfolio, to let people to be entrepreneurial. It is also very important to establish a sturdy democracy, because that means stability, and that means that there are also foreign investments that flow in the country, and also that it needs to respect its social and cultural heritage, which in case of Latin America is that there is almost like a traditional entrepreneurial spirit that has to be kind of taken seriously and helped to unleash for the good of the country. And only then we can say that these examples of the mistakes and of the degeneration of these countries could provide a kind of a clear example how not to run policies in Latin America or anywhere else for that sake. And so with these examples, I hope that I can show some light to the current problems, but also to show some light to how to overcome those current problems and build a pathway to the future which is always different. Subscribe to my channel, share this video with your friends, and learn more about the future.